Hello, welcome to this video. And this video is going to be called Mad Musical Hello, welcome to this video. And this video is going to be called Mad Musical Connections #1. Now, I've done this a little bit before in the past, and I've done it on my Patreon as well. But I'm really going to go to town with this. This is something I have done for years, and it's really taken from a sort of documentary series that was around about 1980, I would say, here in the UK. And it was hosted by James Burke, and it was called Connections. And I absolutely love this TV series. And James Burke would come on and he would mention something like a pen. And then he would show you how the pen was invented because they invented the steam engine or something like that. I don't know, that's not true. But he would go through all these connections, and it would make you feel that the world was much more interconnected than we think. Now, last night I watched the documentary Becoming Led Zeppelin, and it really impressed me. And the feeling I got to it was something that's apparent in doing this YouTube, is how important it is to be aware of the connectedness through art and music that we all have with each other, that you're watching this because you're connected to something that you find motivating, at least, that I'm doing here, which is the music and the art. And the thing that took all those guys in Led Zeppelin on the voyage into their life was that, and I'm connected to that, you're connected to that, we're all connected. And this idea was really put in my head 45 years ago watching James Burke's Connections. So for many years, I played a game called Musical Connections, and what you do is you take anything in music, and then you think of connection it's got to something else in music, and then a connection that you've got to that, and then you go off on like an odyssey through musical history, through culture, through all these different things, and you go weaving your way through. And you have to eventually get back. You have to get back like you've gone on a voyage, like Odysseus, and then you eventually got to return back to where you first started from. It's not really a game, but it's got the quality of a game. Now, the reason why I haven't done it on this channel is that my videos are improvised, and I'm going to try to improvise this one, but I have got a whole ton of notes here that I will be following, and I am also going to try and illustrate it with photographs and maybe bits of video and all sorts of things so that we can go on this musical journey. And I hope what you get is, by doing this, you're going to go, wow, I never knew that. And some of the connections will be so strange that you will see how the world really works and how specific and bizarre it is, and how we're all a product, especially when it comes to the aesthetic aspects of us, of these strange sliding doors type moments, of which we're going to have maybe 100 on here. So if you will indulge me on this, then I would like to introduce you to Mad Musical Connections #1. Now, in the Led Zeppelin documentary that I watched last night, that I felt this very strong connectedness to, one of the things that was really interesting is that Robert mentioned a ballroom in my town. Now, this ballroom was run by a guy called Frank Freeman. He had a ballroom where we would teach ballroom dancing in a little, market town in the Midlands, Frank Freeman. And I would have stopped there because it's a great place to start. In a way, it's quite mundane. But Frank Freeman wasn't mundane. Frank Freeman had, it seems, for an oldish bloke that was into ballroom dancing, he seemed to have the energies and interests that a creative person would have. And so he would go to the kids and say, oh, what are you into? And they would say, we're into these bands. And at this point in the late 60s or mid 60s, they're into a lot of really psychedelic bands, weird bands. The music's changing, the whole culture's changing. Now, he said, what bands would you like to have on? And they mentioned these bands, and he goes and books them. He books bands like Early Yes with Peter Banks and Tony Kaye. He books Fleetwood Mac. At one point, he books Captain Beefheart and brings Captain Beefheart to play in this little ballroom dancing club. Starts to sell tickets, and the musicians that are around in this club, they start to see these incredible bands in this little town. It brings musicians together. And out of this, part of the story of the formation of the Band of Joy with John Bonham and Robert Plant, is formed in this little ballroom dance group. How do we know that Robert's feeling that there was a connectedness between him and the music going on in the West Coast of America wasn't initiated by being in Frank Freeman's club and watching whoever it was, whether it be T-Rex or even Captain Beefheart, and going, that's there in front of me, I can touch it. So many artists say that. That's what motivates them. They go, oh, I met this person, or I saw that, and suddenly I thought I can touch it. That's where we start. That's for me, the symbol of this catalyst, the little bit of water on the seed that grows into this music industry. Very specific example that I know so well in my hometown, which is Frank Freeman's. Now, as I said, Frank Freeman entertained a performance by the incredible Captain Beefheart. Can you imagine that, I could go downtown to buy some shoes and be aware that where I'm walking, Captain Beefheart's magic band also walked on that spot, and that I know people that were at that gig, and they told me that there was a great guitarist in that band at that time, which was Ry Cooder. All happening in my little town. It affected people. Now, Captain Beefheart, of course, was a child prodigy when he was a youngster. He used to make these little sculptures of animals, lemurs and stuff like this, and he was discovered by quite a well-known sculptor that had a TV show, and he was brought on the TV show. He was a very creative guy, Captain Beefheart was. And so after moving to Lancaster to befriend Frank Zappa and join the Soul Giants with Frank Zappa, that moved him over to indulge his love of rhythm and blues. Beefheart is a very avant-garde musician, but what's interesting is that at one point he works as a vacuum seller. He sold vacuums door to door. Can you imagine having Captain Beefheart coming to your door as a salesman trying to sell you a vacuum cleaner? Well, this actually happened. And one day he turned up and knocked the door of Aldous Huxley's house and sold him a vacuum cleaner. Now, Aldous Huxley was from a very academic family. His brother was Thomas Huxley, who I believe was a biologist. Aldous Huxley was a philosopher. He was a writer. He wrote the book Brave New World. But he's also famous for being an early adopter of LSD, and he believed that LSD could give you some sort of mystical, spiritual experiences, thus really laying the groundworks for the revolution that Beefheart and that lot are going to be a part of in the West Coast music scene that Robert Plant loves so much. Aldous Huxley plays a part in that, very interesting part of that. When Aldous Huxley discovered he got esophageal cancer in the early 60s, when he was on death's door, he dropped acid so that he could die on acid. God knows what happened in there. We'll never know. But yes, he sold a vacuum cleaner. Captain Beefheart sold a vacuum cleaner to Aldous Huxley. Now, his vision of the sort of psychedelic and the spiritual influenced that scene. And probably the most strongest influence would be from his book, The Doors of Perception. Jim Morrison took that name and, of course, formed the band The Doors. Now, The Doors, one of the most important bands in that West Coast scene where we start, made a series of incredible albums before Jim Morrison sadly died in 1971, leaving The Doors a bit high and dry. And The Doors then went on to form another band, which was called the Butts Band. I think it was John Densmore and maybe Ray Manzarek formed a band called the Butts Band, but it's definitely two of the members of The Doors. And what they did is they took on another guy, another singer that had been in the audience in Frank Freeman's at this dance club. This is a singer called Jess Roden, one of the country's greatest singers. He comes from my town, as well as Robert Plant. He went on to be the singer in a band called Bronco that was signed to Island Records in the early 70s, who my best friend and mentor played guitar for, Kevin Gammon. Jess Roden then went on to a solo career and then went on to sing in the Butts Band, almost replacing, in a way, Jim Morrison in The Doors. It's quite interesting, this is. But Jess Roden, through that island connection with Bronco, also ended up singing backing vocals on the song Pull Up to the Bumper by Grace Jones. The guy that ran Island Records, Blackwell, Chris Blackwell, also was very important in the connection between reggae and the UK and supporting many reggae bands. Eventually taking on Grace Jones, who was a supermodel, but off with her creating some of the greatest music of the early 80s, things like Slave to the Rhythm and Pull Up to the Bumper, an absolute classic track. And yes, Jess Rose and his connection to Island Records meant he's singing backing vocals on that song. Who'd have thought it? Now, who was on keyboards on that track? Well, it was a guy called Wally Badarou. Now, Badarou's connections to all sorts of different music cannot be underestimated. Wally Badarou was the mentor, much the same way Kevin Gammon, who was the guitarist of Band of Joy, was a mentor to me when I met him as a young age. Wally Badarou was a mentor to the guys that went on to form Level 42. Now, around about 1978-79, when I was discovering music, there was a song that really made me realise I loved music. And I wish I could say, and I've said it, that Ace of Spades was very important, new wave of British heavy metal. But that wasn't the single. There was three artists I absolutely loved before I went towards the new wave of British heavy metal. One was Amy Stewart, that did a song called Ring My Bell. The other was Ian during the Blockheads, because he did sing a song called Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick. But my favourite song of all, a tune that I was absolutely obsessed with, was a tune called Pop Music with a K by the band M. Now, they put a brilliant album out, and Wally Badarou was the keyboardist on that album, along with Phil Gould, who then went on to become the drummer of Level 42. Now, of course, Level 42, a very interesting band, because they had their background listed to American jazz rock fusion. But in putting vocals on a sort of Return to Forever type of sound, making it more commercial, Mark King's incredible slap bass playing, they became one of the preeminent sort of pop bands of the sort of early 80s jazz funk scene here in the UK. And went on to really lay the groundwork for things like acid jazz and things like that later on in that decade. But of course, they had an allegiance to the jazz rock and jazz fusion. Now, I'm connected to Level 42 in that when I was in Frost, after John Jowett left in 2008, I believe, we then took on Nathan King, who is the brother of Mark King and is the guitarist in Level 42. And this was a real honour for me, because as a young man, I was very, very influenced by Level 42. Now, Level 42, being fans of progressive rock and jazz rock fusion, actually brought in the greatest guitarist who's ever lived on one of their albums and for a tour. And that is, of course, the great Alan Holdsworth. Now, when I play this game, I always have to mention John McLaughlin and Alan Holdsworth. They have to all be mentioned as we make the journey through. There's a few other musicians that I would like to mention in this journey. So I've managed to get Alan Holdsworth. There's a tick for Alan Holdsworth now on this list. Have to have Alan Holdsworth on the list. If I ever do this again, John McLaughlin and Alan Holdsworth will always be mentioned on the list. So we are awaiting John McLaughlin in this journey through the music history and industry. Right, so Holdsworth played on, I wish I could remember the name of the album. It came out after they had their great big World Machine, the great big serious album, very popular album. Now, Alan Holdsworth has a very strange and tenuous link to Star Trek. This is how bizarre this connection is. He is a massive fan of Star Trek, or he was a massive fan. And there's a series, one of the episodes of Star Trek, they have this thing where I think you can travel through time called the Atavachron. And the Atavachron is featured on the cover of the album Atavachron by Alan Holdsworth. And if you look at the cover of that, he's actually wearing a top from the Starship Enterprise crew, what they would wear on the Starship Enterprise. It's bizarre. But the link to Star Trek doesn't end there. There's a very famous story now where Alan Holdsworth is on tour and he comes down to the hotel room about to go to the gig, and arriving in the lobby of the hotel is William Shatner. And that desire to go towards the things that you love, which is what really this list is about, drew him towards William Shatner. And as he walks up to William Shatner looks at Alan Holdsworth and assumes he's there to take his bags up to his room. And so he says to Alan Holdsworth, unknowing that he's talked to the greatest guitarist in the history of music, he said, excuse me, could you take my bags up to your room? At that point, Alan Holdsworth doesn't say another word. He picks the bags up and he takes the bags up to Alan Holdsworth's room. William Shatner's room. And William Shatner is very, thank you very much. Gives the baby a tip and he goes back downstairs. And I find these little sort of pictures in our mind of these events that happen very interesting. Now, of course, William Shatner, not only is he a great actor, and not only is he a 94-year-old, only surviving member of the Star Trek crew, except for the Chinese bloke, what was his name? He's still around as well. They're incredibly old. William Shatner, who on my list here, I've just noticed, I've shortened it to Shats. So it then says, Shats made an album called Ponder the Universe, which was produced by the great Billy Sherwood, who took over from Chris Squire. And yes, you see, we got the prog there. And Billy Sherwood brings a whole host of musicians on this album that Shats made called Ponder the Universe. Does anyone else call him Shats? Well, I've created this on this video. Anyway, do you want to know the people that were on this album along with Shats? We've got Mick Jones from The Clash is on there. We've got Simon Harris is on there. Steve Vai turns up and does some guitar playing, along with the great Al Di Meola. We've got Rick Wakeman, who plays on a track called Change, or is it probably Changes? We don't know, because did he play piano on the Bowie song? I don't know. We've got Joel van der Grugenbrock. I don't know who that is. I've got a list here. Edgar Winter's on here. Nick Turner from Hawkwind's on here. Vince Gill's on here. Edgar Froese is on here. Robbie Krieger from The Doors. We mentioned him early on. Well, we mentioned The Doors anyway. Dave Koz. George Duke, the great George Duke, played with Frank Zappa, and Zoot Horn Rollo, who played with Captain Beefheart. Can you see the connectedness here in that list? It's so bizarre, isn't it? Now, which one am I going to pick from on this list? Who are we going to do? Well, I tell you what, I'm going to get really deep down, because if you actually get into the list of credits on this album, we also have Tony Kaye, the original pianist of Yes, plays on this album for William Shatner. Now, of course, Tony Kaye was part of the original, less successful early lineup of Yes, along with Peter Banks. Now, I'm connected to Peter Banks. That would it be in 2006? I was booked to play at where was it? Rosfest, Progressive Rock Festival. And Peter Banks would have been playing at that festival with my friend Andrew Booker on drums. But when Peter Banks arrived at the airport and we all were going to leave, the people who bought his tickets didn't realise he's not called Peter Banks. The tour manager found out at that point that he was called Peter Brockbanks, and he couldn't go. But I had been slated to get up and perform Time and a Word with him, which I had learnt for that thing, and I thought this is going to be very exciting because I'm going to be able to put that on my CV that I played for Peter Banks. A few years later, he sadly died relatively young. Now, Peter Banks is well known for leaving Yes and then going on to form the progressive rock band Flash. But before that happened, or around the same time, he also goes into the studio and the record company throw everything at him, and he makes an album called Two Sides of Peter Banks. And this has got a whole host of guests. The main guest on it is Jan Ackerman, who's really involved in this album. But we've also got people like Steve Hackett on here, John Wetton's on here, Phil Collins plays drums on here. There's a whole host of people. Now, John Wetton, who is a prog legend, sung for King Crimson, also sung for Roxy Music and sung for Family, all bands that I need to cover in greater detail. But there's one cult prog band that I have mentioned very rarely on this. They made one album and it's a cult prog jazz rock classic, and that is the album by Mogul Thrash. Mogul Thrash, check this album out. And John Wetton was an early member of Mogul Thrash. Now, Mogul Thrash was sort of a proggy in the sort of lineage of a band like Colosseum, John Heisman's band, had brass in it, and a couple of the saxophone players that were in Mogul Thrash went on to join the Average White Band. In fact, it was Malcolm Duncan, I believe, and Roger Ball were the saxophonists on the Mogul Thrash album, and then go on to form the Average White Band. Now, the Average White Band were connected with a guitarist called Jim Mullen, the great Jim Mullen. And Jim Mullen has come to this very room and is actually stood in the exact place I am sat right now and played to a small audience in here. And you can check the video out where Jim Mullen really goes on about his connections to the Average White Band. Now, the great drummer of the Average White Band was a guy called Robbie McIntosh, who died at a party around about 73, I believe, 74. He went to a party and he thought he was taking cocaine, and he wasn't. He was taking heroin laced with morphine, and he had an overdose. They didn't realize what had happened. He just went to sleep, I believe, and didn't wake up. Now, at that party, there was the singer Cher, and Cher realized what was going on. And who was the guy? Alan Gorrie from Average White Band had also taken the same cocaine that was really heroin, and she kept him awake until they were able to get him in an ambulance to hospital. Cher saved Alan Gorrie's life at that party, and my initial reaction to the connection was to go with Alan Gorrie or maybe even Cher. But there's a fact about Robbie McIntosh that I find very, very fascinating. I have a new channel where I'm looking at film and I'm looking at television. The link will be down below here. Now, that channel, one of the first videos I did was to look at the films of Emmerich Pressburger and Michael Powell, because I'm a huge fan of Powell and Pressburger films. And I rank the Powell and Pressburger films, and at the top is my favourite film of all time, which is called A Matter of Life and Death, that came out in 1946, and in America was named Stairway to Heaven. Very strange, isn't it? And in that film, there is an American playing an American soldier that has died and appears in heaven, and he was played by an American that had decamped into the UK in the 1940s and became the actor that played Americans. It was a guy called Bono Corleone. And Bono Corleone was a very recognisable face in 1940s and 50s films. Now, he sadly died in a car crash, I believe in the late 50s, early 60s. But Bono Corleone, before he died, obviously, he had fathered a son, right, illegitimately, I think through a one-night stand with this woman that he'd met, and he was never known to that child, but that child was Robbie McIntosh, the drummer, who also died young in that party. I find these sort of connections absolutely bizarre. Now, as I said earlier, the tunes that really influenced me coming up, and my connection to some of this story, was pop music by M. But I also mentioned another song called Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick by Ian Dury, the great Ian Dury. Now, Ian Dury also did an incredible song, one of my favourite songs of all time, called Reason to Be Cheerful, Part 3. And in that list of the things that makes him cheerful, he mentions Bono Corleone, who was the father, a film star, and also the father of Robbie McIntosh, from the Average White Band, who were like this white soul funk, Scottish funk band that were so convincing that James Brown loved them, that influenced the sound that we are hearing on these Ian Dury and the Blockheads songs. And I don't think, obviously, Ian Dury even knew that when he referenced Bono Corleone, but he does reference a whole bunch of other musicians on that song. He mentions Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, and Scotty Moore. He references the unfortunately named Wee Willie Harris, who I believe may have been like a skiffle musician. He mentions Rico Rodriguez, who was a trumpet player that would then go on to join the Coventry ska band The Specials. He mentions Dmitri Shostakovich. He mentions Smokey Robinson, and he mentions John Coltrane. And I feel I could choose any of those musicians. And the obvious one for me would be John Coltrane, But I'm not. I'm going to go with Scotty Moore because a whole generation of musicians were influenced by Scotty Moore. Now, Scotty Moore obviously was Elvis Presley's guitarist, sort of Chet Atkins style guitar. But there was another guitarist that Scotty Moore often played alongside, and that was a guitarist called Hank Garland. And there's an interesting story about Hank Garland that I'd like to tell you. Not only was a country guitarist, and he was a great jazz guitarist as well. He had a car crash in September 1961, and this car crash left Hank Garland in a coma. He regained consciousness and recovered with the help of his wife Evelyn and the two daughters, but due to this brain injury, he was never able to really play the guitar again. After his wife died at the age of 38 in another car crash in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on December the 2nd, 1965, Hank Garland then was looked after by the parents until their deaths. He then went to live with his brother and Billy and his wife Amy. So Hank Garland is this incredible guitarist, incredible country guitarist, played with Elvis Presley, but was also one of the great jazz guitarists. And he made an album called Jazz Winds from a New Direction in the early 60s, which was one of the greatest jazz guitar albums ever made. It got Joe Benjamin on bass, the great Joe Morello from Dave Brubeck's band on drums, and a very, very young, like really young Gary Burton. I think it was about 15, 16, something like that age, on vibraphone. Now, that album is the album that inspired the singer George Benson to take up guitar and start really studying guitar, or at least Hank Garland was. If you listen to Hank Garland's style, which is very incredible alternate pick style, you could hear that in George Benson's playing. Now, I could have gone down the George Benson route, but it's only an influence, and we don't do influences on this. But what we do is direct connections, and Gary Burton is the one. Now, Gary Burton studied under a guy called Herb Pomeroy. And through his studies with Herb Pomeroy in composition and arrangement, he befriended a composer and arranger called Michael Gibbs. And Michael Gibbs goes on to be the composer and arranger, especially the arranger in the jazz rock era in the 1970s. If there's ever a string section and a brass section on a Stanley Clarke album or whatever it is, check it out and you will see that it was arranged by Michael Gibbs. Now, Michael Gibbs was brought in by John McLaughlin. Tick, we've got him to arrange on the first Mavish Orchestra album by the second version of the Mavish Orchestra album, which featured Narada Michael drums. It's so hard doing this one. Narada Michael Walden on drums. Tick, I've got Narada in as well. He arranged Apocalypse by the Mavish Orchestra, basically. And of course, that was famously produced by George Martin. Now, George Martin also produced, Goldfinger, right? Now, Goldfinger featured 4 guitarists on that session: Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan, John Paul Jones, and Jimmy Page. Now, Vic Flick, if you go back to one of my videos, Kevin Gammond, who was the guitarist in the Band of Joy with Robert Plant and John Bonham, went on to form a band called Bronco. I mentioned him earlier. That was the band that Jess Roden was the singer of. And there is a video where Kev, who is one of my best friends and my mentor, he enters here and he lets me and Andy Robinson, who's a comedian we were filming a video, and he just bursts in and he lets us know that Vic Flick had died that day. So there's a direct connection to this channel now with all this madness. Big Jim Sullivan, of course, was the guitarist that befriended John McLaughlin and Jimmy Page and introduced John McLaughlin to Eastern philosophy. Very interesting stuff going on here. But the other 2 guitarists and bass player on that session for Goldfinger that George Martin produced was Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, who of course then went on to form Led Zeppelin. Now, John Paul Jones nearly didn't get the gig with Led Zeppelin because he got offered the bass position with the Shadows, replacing Licorice Locklin. Now, Licorice Locklin was Brian Locklin, Brion Loughlin, can you say Andy? Practice it. Brion Loughlin, you've said a lot so far. Half an hour this has been going on for. Brion Loughlin was the bass player with the Shadows, and that band, along with Big Jim Sullivan and Brian Bennett, was the backing band on the tour which Larry Parnes put on in 1960 that featured Marty Wilde, Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent. And another singer that was on that tour was a singer called Peter Wynn. And Peter Wynn is my wife's dad. And Peter Wynn is the grandfather of my kids. So I think that's a definite connection there. Now, Peter Wynn, when he did that tour with Brion Loughlin on bass, befriended Eddie Cochran. And Eddie Cochran, well, there's so many connections here, but let's back up. In his later years, my father-in-law, Peter Wynn, reconnected with Brion Loughlin. And the reason is because unbeknownst to Pete, Brion had moved up into the local area where Pete lived. And in the same way as Hank Marvin became a Jehovah's Witness, so did Brion. And Brion was going door to door and happened to knock on my father-in-law's door and say, it's a Jehovah's Witness, do you want to come in? And Pete turned around and went, oh my God, it's Brion. Remember you played bass for me? And they all made friends and he came in. And Brion Loughlin gave his harmonica to my wife. I don't know if she's still got it. Now, on that tour, Pete, my father-in-law, I'm going to keep tracks on this so you realise how bizarre all this is. He befriended Eddie Cochran and they did a show in Bristol and they came out and Eddie turned round to Pete and said, I'm going back to the States. I'll get you a pair of American jeans and bring them back. And at this point, they were trying to get back to London and Pete had acquired a taxi. And so he was holding this taxi for someone. And then Eddie Cochran comes over with Gene Vincent. And Gene Vincent, who never liked my father-in-law, said, Pete, we're having that taxi. Kicked Pete out and jumped in that taxi. And they went speeding off. Or that car or whatever it was. I think it was a taxi. It might just have been a car that they grabbed. Now, that car famously crashed and killed Eddie Cochran. The famous crash in 1960 that killed Eddie Cochran really should have been my father-in-law. Now, when the police got to it, all the stuff that was in that car was impounded by the police until a coroner's inquest could be held. David Harmon, who was a police cadet at the station where he was held, would later be known as Dave D. of the band Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch. Right? And he discovered Eddie Cochran's Gretsch 6120 guitar and pulled it out having an interest in music and started to strum this guitar, thus giving birth to the band Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch, who had a number of hit records in the late 60s. Right? Now, on their debut album, they utilised an up-and-coming DJ to narrate the beginning of one of their songs. And that DJ was the great Kenny Everett, an absolute hero of mine. Now, Kenny Everett was a Radio 1 DJ. He was very zany. He was incredible. He had a TV show here in the late 70s, early 80s. I was a massive fan of Kenny Everett. Cupid Stunt, yeah, I did just say that. That bloke, the French bloke that would come out, the mime artist. It was just the best comedy ever. I love Kenny Everett. Now, he had a character called Sid Snot. And in 1983, he brought out a single that went to number 8 in the charts here in the UK called Snot Rap, which I think was pretty way out, because in 1983 here in the UK, rap wasn't a big thing. Rap had only just emerged about 3 years before. So for him to be lampooning rap, I think shows how ahead of the game Kenny was. Now, Kenny was best mates with the Queen singer Freddie Mercury, and he sadly died of AIDS around about the same time as Freddie did, and he was a great loss. He's one of my favourite comedians, and Kenny Everett's show and the irreverence and the zaniness and weirdness has been a big influence on me, and it's influenced this channel. My sort of naughtiness of just wanting to go that bit far really comes from Kenny Everett. Now, Snot Rap was produced by a British producer called Michael Moran that produced a whole host of different records, right? And he was also a musician, and one of his session credits was he actually played on an album of Oliver Nelson, the great American jazz arranger, Oliver Nelson, that wrote the tune Stolen Moments. And Oliver Nelson had come over to London at some point, and he'd done his sort of very hip arrangements of Cockney, London songs, and it was the Creighton album, which was called In London it was called Oily Rags. That's the one. And on that was featured the great Cockney music duo Chaz and Dave. Now, I often try and get Chaz and Dave in because, of course, Chaz and Dave, you probably think, they're going to tell me the fact about Chaz and Dave, that they actually came up with the riff on the Labby Sifri track that was then sampled by Eminem for My Name Is. But I'm not going down that route. No, I can go even weirder than that. Is that Chaz and Dave, Chaz Hodgetts, played in the backing band for Mike Berry. Now, Mike Berry was a singer, but also an actor. Now, Mike Berry died just a few days before. So I mentioning Mike Berry, he was a great actor. He was in the later part of the acting crew that made the British sitcom Are You Being Served? But he was also played the dad in one of my favourite TV series, Wurzel Gummidge. Wurzel Gummidge that featured the great John Pertwee. But Mike Berry had a band which was basically the Outlaws in the 1960s. Now, the Outlaws is famous because its guitarist, of course, was the great Ritchie Blackmore. This band was put together by Joe Meek in the early 60s. But it also featured a drummer called Mick Underwood. And Mick Underwood would later become the drummer of the band Gillan, which made 3 incredible albums that influenced me greatly. Glory Road, Future Shock, and this is hard. Future Shock. You don't have to get them all, Andy. Future Shock, Glory Road, and another one, Double Trouble. I love those albums. I love that Gillan band, with Bernie Tormey on guitar. Absolutely incredible. Now, Mick Underwood was also the drummer of the progressive rock band Quatermass, right? And in that band, right, was what was his name? Right, but I can't remember that bit. I've done all right, though. There's been a lot of information here to try and retain, because I've just got a few bullet points here. So anyway, he was in the band Quatermass. And Quatermass had a song on that album, they only made one album, I believe, called Black Sheep of the Family. Now, Ritchie Blackmore, who had been the Outlaws, was aware of that tune and actually covered it on his debut album called Richard Blackmore's Rainbow, the debut Rainbow album. You probably know Black Sheep of the Family, but it wasn't written by Quatermass. It was just covered by Quatermass, which is why Ritchie Blackmore was aware of it, because he knew those guys. But it was actually written by the band Fat Mattress. I've remembered now. And Fat Mattress featured on bass Noel Redding from the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Now, Jimi Hendrix was friends with Frank Zappa and appears on the cover of We're Only In It For The Money. So we now return back to Frank Zappa. Now, Frank Zappa, in the early 70s, had a vocal duo who had originally been in a band who'd had a hit record, and that band was called The Turtles. And there was a singing duo called Flo and Eddie. It's not my favourite part of the Zappa oeuvre, but Flo and Eddie performed on 200 Motels in the early 70s. Now, I am now going to bring us back to Frank Freeman's, that club in my town where he started, with 3 connections. Firstly, Frank Zappa, Flo and Eddie. Well, Flo and Eddie also sang backing vocals on Electric Warrior, which was the most popular album by T-Rex, right? Remember that? T-Rex are connected directly to Flo and Eddie. Now on keyboards, we have on Get It On, Rick Wakeman, the legendary prog keyboardist with Yes, right? And Zappa was childhood friends as we started with Captain Beefheart. And T-Rex, Captain Beefheart, and Yes all played at Freeman. And with this, if you wanted to, you could now go back to the beginning with Frank Freeman's and do the whole journey again for infinity around these bizarre connections that exist within the history of the music business. Now, I hope you enjoyed that bizarre voyage through music history. And I hope it threw up a certain aspect of music history that we don't get to cover on here. And it's these strange, idiosyncratic connections that are actually what makes life go forth. And the reason why we can do this and we connect everything to anything is because we are all connected. You, me, all these musicians, music, art, we're connected together. We are one species on this beautiful planet. It's a beautiful day today. And that has been my illustration of how connected we are. I hope you enjoyed it. It's at the end of the video. Please like and subscribe. If you like this madness, you should check out my new film and TV channel. There's been a lot of knowledge there about film and TV here as well. And I've got a bit of an interest in that type of stuff. So please go across. If you like what I do here on the music side, then go and check out my film and TV channel, which is called The Magic Box, named after the Robert Donat film from the early 70s. And I also have a politics channel, although we didn't do much politics on here. Whoa, that was hard. That was hard. If I do one of these again, it's bloody hard because I'm really having to rely on a lot of memory here. And I'm not too sure whether I'm going. I've got bullet points, and there was a certain avenues that I decided to take, and I knew there's parallel. This is a really interesting, I love doing this. I'll often, if I can't sleep, I will then go, right, let's just start with someone and see where it goes, and you try and create these connections. It's a wonderful thing. I hope you enjoyed it. So if you did, like it, subscribe, and please, if you want to go and see my new channels, go and do that. I've got a Patreon as well. You could become a free member or a paid member. What else can you do? You could also put some money in the PayPal tip jar, which I might need for counselling after doing this one. I've got so much, I can't get my words out. I did all right, didn't I? I felt like I got a bit stuttery. I do that anyway, but I felt like I was a tour de force. I feel like I should be getting some sort of pat on the back for this, and I'm not getting anything anywhere. But all the way throughout this video, a figure kept appearing on my left. I'm not joking. And if you rewind it back, you can watch it and see me doing this every now and then. And I did one on Led Zeppelin. It happened earlier. I'm sure it's just an optical illusion, but there just seems to be someone standing here the whole time. And then I look around and they're not there. Who could it be? I bet it's Mike Berry, the late, great Mike Berry that was in Wurzel Gummidge and Are You Being Served, that also was the singer with the Outlaws and had a number of hit records in the 1960s. So rest in peace, Mike. I was a big fan of yours in Wurzel Gummidge, love Wurzel Gummidge, and I love the drumming on not the starting music. I loved it on both, but the end music on Wurzel Gummidge, the drumming is incredible. I used to watch that as a very young drummer, thinking, how could this drummer be playing this stuff? It's bizarre and incredible. So can you, if anyone can tell me who the drummer is on the soundtrack to Wurzel Gummidge, because I've tried to find it out, I would love to start there for my next connections. We'll start there if we can with that drummer. I wonder who he is. He's a monster. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.